Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh Shams. It's an honor to have you with us today, and thank you for your speech on the life and personality of Fatima bint Muhammad radiyallahu ta'ala anha. I'd like to start by asking about yourself, your background, your education, and the reason and thought processes that caused you to go into studying the deen.
I don't really have a really dramatic story. I think most of the credit goes to my parents, to be honest, because they really sheltered me from having too many choices. That's the honest truth. I don't have a rags to riches or turning from one way to the other story. I was brought up to want to study the deen, right? I was brought up to want to memorize the Quran. From as far back as I can remember, my father taught me the virtues of memorizing the Quran and the virtues of seeking knowledge and so forth. I can probably remember them as far back as the age of 6, 7. Growing up in degrees in Akhirah, you recite verses, and parents being made to wear crowns and things like that, and interceding for family members if you memorize the Quran or if you seek knowledge. Those are my childhood memories. My father spent a lot of time speaking to us about these things. So I memorized the Quran. My brothers memorized the Quran. I pursued knowledge of the Sharia. So did my brothers. Pretty much all of us. And that's kind of my life. So I started memorizing the Quran. I think I was on a trip in Bangladesh. I think at the age of 8 or 9, and it was like, I can recite the Quran with some tajweed, and why don't I just go along with my cousin who's memorizing the Quran and start? And it just started. And in that trip, I memorized Surah Baqarah, and it just carried on. And when I was the right age, the institution that I went to study as an Islamic seminary up north in Yorkshire, I was waiting. It was something that was always there. I went to secondary school knowing that at year 8 I'd be dropping out to go to boarding school. Right? So that's kind of how it happened. And then I think when you're in that atmosphere, the danger is sometimes you can just take all of that for granted, and you don't get the kind of jolt, that moment where you move from one type of life to another type of life, and that gives you the boost to achieve. You sometimes don't get that because this is all you've ever experienced, right? So you have to then take inspiration from what you learn, from the knowledge that you gain from your studies and so forth. And I think much of what I went on to do later on really came from my observations of my own experience as a student of knowledge, how I felt about Islamic education and to what extent that was the solution for the difficulties of the Ummah and so forth, that really shaped the choice of work later. I don't always like calling it a career, because I think myself and the colleagues I work with, I think our life was always about this work. That was how it always was. We never even thought about jobs, to be honest. So for us, it was all about what we were going to do and what we were going to prioritize and why. And we decided that it was going to be education. And we decided that if we were going to make a success of it, then we had to produce a better standard of scholars that were completely immersed in the context of the West. And therefore we started Ebrahim College and things like the Alamiya program.
Many a times, Islam is portrayed as a misogynistic religion which seeks to install a society within which women cannot contribute. Yet the Sahabiyat were dynamic and active characters who made a lasting impact upon history. What specific advice can you give to sisters in this day and age about making such an impact upon society today?
Yes, Jazakallah. Firstly, I think we are asking the question in a particular context, right? There's a historical narrative, a story, a trajectory in terms of women's rise and forward, and however you want to look at it, right? And I think it's important to acknowledge that we are speaking in a context where there is a broader external narrative of women's equality, of feminism, and so on and so forth. And it's important that we don't ask, that our question isn't framed from that perspective, but is an objective question purely framed from an Islamic outlook. I think only then can we truly address this question. So when we say if we come to the conclusion that women do not women are that women have been treated badly or are not treated equally and so on and so forth, that critique is a critique that comes from an Islamic perspective as opposed to a feministic perspective. I think that's the first thing. Having said all of that, my personal evaluation of the situation is that something did go wrong in our history somewhere. Something went wrong, and I think the position that women that in early Islam enjoyed was somehow lost in most places in the Muslim world. Right? I think women were pushed out of not necessarily public spaces, but I would say spaces of virtue, right? That they had a contribution to make in, such as education, such as da'wah, and so on. You know, things that Islamically, before modern times, we valued because of the fact that they were valuable, right? And ultimately, that's what we measure achievement in terms of, right? For us, a woman becomes an engineer. We value that in the same way that we value a man becoming an engineer. For us, things that were valuable because they are intrinsically valuable were things that were to do with our objectives in life, our ibadah, seeking knowledge, serving the community, serving people, making people's life better, alleviating poverty, those types of things. And I think those are things that women were definitely engaged in. And then somehow they disappeared from. So I think from an Islamic perspective, there is a question that needs to be answered. And I think the way to address it is, again, building up the capacity of women in areas of virtue that are virtuous from an Islamic perspective. And I think one of the first places that we start in is worship and knowledge. Worship in terms of what masajid do for women, right? And how we can build the quality of our worship as a community and keep women as part of that conversation. And in the area of knowledge, in terms of equal access, in terms of making sure that the standard of education is the same as what men get, so that when a man is inspired by the knowledge of Islam to achieve something, a woman's inspiration is from the same source, and therefore her achievement is for the sake of the same objectives, inspired by the same thing. And I think that's really what's missing, and that's what we need to do. And I think part of my work is dedicated to that. I think we've made some significant steps in making sure that women's access to the deen and everything that the deen has to offer as a transformative force in our lives is equal for both men as well as women.
Jazakallahu khair, Shaykh. We are living in an age of widespread Islamophobia, from media to antagonistic governmental policies towards Muslims. To put it into context, we've had the whole issue with Muslim majority schools recently. How do we go about solving these issues, and what is the danger if we carry on remaining disengaged?
Right. First of all, the solution to these problems aren't in our hands at the moment, because we are not the decision makers and we are not the people who are creating the situation. Ultimately, the government is. So I think there is an important question in terms of how any one of us might evaluate the government's performance in that regard. And I would say that the whole counterterrorism strategy that is in place at the moment, terrorism is a problem, extremism is a problem, but I think the strategy in place at the moment, in the whole contest to kind of prevent strategy and the way in which the whole thing is being dealt with, and I think the recent inspections of Muslim schools and the downgrading of them is just it's just a symptom of a wider issue. I think it's going to be seen in history as the single biggest failure, to the point of stupidity, that any government has ever been a part of. Right? I think first and foremost, I need to say that as an important soundbite. What we can do, first of all, we have to continue to resist, right? Because we're talking about a strategy that seeks to mark fundamental aspects and legitimate aspects of our religion as signs of extremism. So I know personal stories of young children who have expressed something that is culturally different, right? Possibly has something to do with Islam, that are being referred to social services, right, from their schools. Children who refuse to free mix being referred to social services. The schools but are being evaluated by Ofsted, right, for signs of radicalism by asking ridiculous questions to children like whether they have female friends or not. For the life of us as Muslims, we don't understand why that has anything to do with radicalization. And so on. So the danger in all of this is that we're all being forced into a corner, painted with the same brush, and we're being told, you're Muslims, we don't have anything against you, but we definitely have something against things that your religion has to say. And if you say the same thing, then you're an extremist. The fact of the matter is, we do say the same thing, and we are not extremists.
Jazakallahu khair, Shaykh Shams Ad Duha. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.